All right, so we're going to begin our final unit for grade 9 science. That's going to be about space and space exploration. So you may have heard in the news recently that SpaceX, a company, successfully launched 2 astronauts into space. They sent them to the International Space Station, and that was pretty big news. They're the first private company to send any humans into space. They were NASA astronauts. What I want to do is go over kind of a timeline of some of the major milestones for space exploration, culminating in what just happened a couple of weeks ago. All right. So we're going to kick things off in the year 1946. If you know your history, you may know that this is shortly after World War II. So in 1946, the first human-made object flew into space. The first object that was created and designed by human beings got launched into outer space. So there's like a limit, like the edge of the Earth, and they were able to send this rocket past that limit, and it was called a V2 rocket. And so during the war, there were lots of scientists working on, well, rocket design. I mean, they were thinking about using rockets as weapons and whatnot. So actually, there was a lot of work going into making better and better rockets. And after the war, they were able to take some of their designs and what they learned and eventually design a rocket that reached all the way to outer space. So that's where our journey kind of begins, I guess, with these milestones in terms of exploring outer space. So that was 1946. So that's about 75 years ago, approximately. Okay, almost. So not even a century old. Then we're going to jump to 1957. So the next goal was to get something to do a full orbit of the Earth. Okay, so the first milestone was to just get something up there into space. But now we want something to be able to go orbit all around the Earth. So nowadays, we have lots and lots of satellites that are orbiting the Earth all of the time. Okay, well, the very first thing to ever orbit the Earth that was designed by humans was this spacecraft here that was called Sputnik. And it was accomplished by the Soviet space program. So back in those times, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, there was something called a space race. Space race. It was basically the two superpowers of the world, which was the United States of America and Russia, were kind of trying to outdo each other in terms of space accomplishments. Okay, both countries wanted to be the first to do this, the first to do that. So Sputnik was the first to orbit the Earth, and that was accomplished by the Russian space program. Then the target was the moon. Okay, so we successfully get things going around the Earth in orbit. So now we set our sights to the moon. So just 2 years after Sputnik, in 1959, Luna 2 was the first spacecraft built by humans that was able to hit the moon. And you can imagine the complicated mathematics and physics and science all required to do that. Okay, some of us have a hard enough time getting a basketball into a hoop. Try getting something that you launch from Earth to get all the way and hit the moon. All right, so a lot of work, a lot of great minds went into that, and once again, this was first accomplished by the Russian or the Soviet space program. And then how about getting a human being into space? Okay, so everything in the slideshow before this was just things built by humans and launched into space. How about getting an actual person into space? So Yuri Gagarin gets to be distinguished as the very first human being to go into space. So we'll call him the first astronaut ever. And he was a Russian astronaut as well. So he's like a hero back in Russia because this is a big deal to them, their space program. And then not long after, they got Yuri Gagarin into space. They flew the first female, the first woman astronaut into space as well. Also a Russian. Her name was Valentina Tereshkova. That was 1963. And then, so you may recall Luna 2 was the first spaceship to hit the moon. Well, we want to do better than just hitting the moon. We want to be able to land on the moon softly. So to get a spacecraft, a vehicle, to land on the surface and remain intact. So the Russians accomplished that first again. So it seems like they're winning lots and lots of these space races. And that was Luna 9. Okay, so 8 lunas after, or 7 lunas after, they eventually got a design where they were able to land softly on the moon. So the next step after that, now that we can land a spacecraft softly on the moon, is to get a human being to get onto the moon. And the first human beings to step foot on the moon, you may recognize their names, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. So this was 1969. So the mission, the Luna program was the name of the moon program for the Russians. The Apollo program was the name for the program for the Americans trying to get to the moon. So these 3 astronauts flew an Apollo mission that was able to do that. The third person, you may wonder why there's only 2 people who stepped foot. Well, you need another person to fly the spacecraft that was kind of ready to take them home afterwards. Okay, you didn't want to just leave that unpiloted. So the third person, his name was Michael Collins, was manning the spacecraft while the other 2 were stepping foot on the moon. So after the moon, what would be the next focus? Well, the next focus was Mars. So in 1971, Mars 3 became the first spacecraft to land softly on Mars. This was and accomplished by the American space program first, so NASA. They got Mars 3 to land onto the surface of the moon, and it was able to take about 20 seconds of footage of video before they lost communication with it. Then they also focused on trying to visit the other planets as well. So you're going to learn that out of the planets of the solar system, the inner planets, so the 4 that are closest to the sun, they are terrestrial planets. So they have land. So spacecraft can actually land on them. The ones beyond Mars, so I'm talking about Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, those are called gas giant planets. So they're made up of entirely gases. So you can't actually have anything land on them. Like we could have something land on Mars and on the moon. However, you still can send spaceships to them and kind of fly close to those gas giants and try to take some pictures and collect some data about those gas giants. And that was the mission of Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. Okay, designed by NASA. We call them probes. So, I mean, the word probe means to like kind of check things out, to scope things out. So these 2 probes were sent, and they went to visit all of the planets in the solar system. Imagine the mathematics required for that, because all the planets are all orbiting the sun, and they all orbit at a different speed, and they're at different distances. So you have to somehow plan it so that it's able to go from one planet to the next, to the next, to the next, and get close enough to actually be able to collect some data. There's a lot of math and physics involved in that. So by 1989, they managed to visit the last planet in the solar system. So I'm not sure if they mean Neptune or if they mean Pluto, because Pluto used to be classified as a planet. It's not classified as a planet anymore. So Neptune would be the farthest planet in our solar system. So that's 1977. So we're getting closer and closer to present times. All these successes we've talked about, not everything is a success. There's been some tragedies too, in particular, come to my mind. The first one was the Challenger disaster. So I don't remember this one personally. That happened in 1986. I would have been 2 years old. But there was a space shuttle called Challenger that NASA wanted to send up, but it broke apart 73 seconds after the launch. None of the crew members survived, including a school teacher. So they wanted to have the first teacher visit space, but unfortunately the space shuttle did not make it. And that was the first major disaster with loss of human life from the NASA space shuttle program. Continuing on now, 1997, the target is still Mars. So Mars 3 landed and got 20 seconds of footage. They wanted to do better than that. So this spacecraft called Mars Pathfinder and Sojourner. Mars Pathfinder landed on Mars, and along with it was a robot that was named Sojourner. And this robot, you see a picture here, it had wheels, so it actually drove around a bit on the surface of Mars. So when we have a robot that can actually move around the surface of a planet, we're going to call it a rover. Okay, we're going to call it a rover. So Sojourner was the first rover on Mars. It was able to travel about 100 meters away from the landing spot, from where Pathfinder was, and collected some data. It stayed active for almost 3 months before it kind of lost communication. And that was longer than the intended mission. They were only hoping for 1 week, actually, but they got almost 3 months out of Sojourner. And that was the first rover. To date, there's been 4. The International Space Station, okay, so different countries, so the European Space Agency, the Russian Space Program, and NASA, and the Canadian Space Agency have all been a part of this. This is a gigantic space station, or gigantic satellite, I guess. They call it a space station. It's orbiting around and around and around the Earth. So astronauts will live on this space station for months at a time. And it orbits the Earth 15 times a day. Imagine that view. And in 2013, you may have heard of this name before. Chris Hadfield was the first Canadian astronaut to be able to be the commander of the International Space Station. So lots of research, lots of science experiments are done in space. Experiments where maybe you want zero gravity to do it. So where can you have an environment where there's no gravity? Well, on the International Space Station. Now, 2001, SpaceX was launched. So this is a private company that's going to start taking over some space missions, because NASA and other government-run space agencies require a lot of taxpayer money, and maybe they don't get enough money to do what they want. So some private companies are now investing in traveling to space. So SpaceX formed in 2001, and I'm going to actually just jump to the last slide because I'm running out of time here. SpaceX is the name. So that company that started in 2001, they're the company that just a couple of weeks ago were the first private company to launch human beings, astronauts, into space. Okay, they helped 2 astronauts get into space. They collaborated with NASA to get 2 astronauts to the International Space Station. So your task for this lesson is to read an article about this SpaceX mission and to answer some questions based on the article. on the Google form.